thanks to my stepsister Claire. That day in the kitchen was one of the most bizarre yet thrilling experiences of my life. It was a typical Wednesday afternoon, and the only sound in the house was the soft ticking of the kitchen wall clock. My dad and his wife Linda were out for the day conducting errands or whatever it was they did when they vanished together, leaving CLA and me alone in the house. I had spent most of the day aimlessly scrolling through the TV stations in an attempt to kill time. Despite being almost the same age, CLA and I had never been close and were quite different from one another. Our relationship had always been friendly but aloof. She was always the methodical, careful girl who had a plan for everything, while I was the easygoing, relaxed kind, happy to go with the flow. We shared a roof and exchanged courteous greetings, but that was about it. However, in the past few weeks, I've noticed that Claire is looking at me differently. First, I thought I was dreaming, but the way her eyes lingered on me for a brief moment too long and the way she seemed to find reasons to be close to me in the same room, sitting just a little too close, caught my attention. I was sitting in the kitchen that afternoon, trying to ignore the weird vibe that seemed to permeate the air whenever CLA was around, while browsing through my phone while the sun shone through the windows. It was subtle, but it was there, and it was beginning to drive me insane. I assumed she had spent the entire day in her room, but I knew she was about to make an appearance when I heard footsteps behind me. I looked up from my phone to see Claire standing in the doorway with her arms folded across her chest. She appeared at ease, but there was something in her gaze that made my heart race a bit quicker. "Hey." Claire's voice broke the stillness as she entered the kitchen. "Hey," I said nonchalantly, attempting to seem cool. "What is going on?" She shrugged and continued into the kitchen, keeping her eyes fixed on mine. She didn't really feel like going downstairs. "This place is rather quiet." "Yes, it's Linda, and Dad won't be back for a bit." I nodded and put my phone down on the table. Claire looked at the time, then back at me, a tiny grin on her lips. Claire went to the stove, took a glass from the cabinet, and filled it with water. I knew that's why I came down, and the words made my stomach tighten. But I wasn't quite sure why there was something different about the way she was looking at me. Something playful yet serious at the same time. I couldn't help but stare at her because of the way she moved, the way her hair flowed freely over her shoulders, and the way her lips curled into a little knowing grin. She moved slowly and carefully, as if she knew I was watching her. And I was. She remarked, "What are you doing in here all alone?" and sipped from her drink before resting against the counter. I shrugged, attempting to be informal since I was bored and wanted to pass the time until they returned. The comment caught me off guard, and I scowled a little. "You've been acting weird lately," she said, nodding, her eyes still fixed on mine. "I don't know, you've been avoiding me," she said, tilting her head, her smile slightly widening. I blinked, surprised by her observation. I hadn't thought I was avoiding her, but perhaps I had, although it wasn't deliberate. I wasn't sure how to deal with the tension that had been building between us. I answered, "I'm not avoiding you," but my tone lacked conviction. She arched an eyebrow and put her glass down on the counter. "Really? Because it feels like you are," I said, shifting uneasily in my seat, uncertain of how to react to the reality that I had been avoiding CLA. It seemed like something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. I wasn't sure why precisely. I had been trying to ignore it, but I wasn't sure if she felt the same way or if it was just me. Knowing that wasn't a very good reason, I answered haltingly, "I've just been busy." Claire's eyes gleamed with something I couldn't quite name, and her smile grew as she moved closer. "You're busy?" Her voice had a playful lilt, but underneath it I sensed something else, something more serious. She was too busy to even speak to me. She wasn't only joking. There was a genuine meaning to what she was saying that she wasn't expressing aloud. She made another step toward her body, only a few feet away from mine, and I could feel the tension in the room increasing, thickening the air between us. I repeated, "I'm not avoiding you, CLA." Even though my voice was caca, trying to maintain my cool, I swallowed hard as my pulse sped. She said, looking into my eyes. I think you are. But you don't have to. I blinked, surprised by what she had said. The room seemed smaller now, and the distance between us was getting less by the second. Claire's closeness was overpowering her, and it was difficult to think clearly, though the words felt hollow. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. CLA moved closer, her face inches from mine, and I could feel the warmth radiating off her skin. My heart was thumping in my chest, and my mind was racing as I tried to comprehend that this was my stepsister, with whom I had lived for 2 years. But she didn't feel like a sister at that moment. She had a completely different feeling. Claire said in a barely audible whisper, You don't have to pretend. You felt it, too. I know. As her words took hold, I tensed up, my breath stopping in my throat. She was correct. The tension and the unsaid bond that had been building between us for weeks were palpable to me. Claudia's hand moved and then reached out to lightly brush against my arm. The contact was light, barely there, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me, making my pulse race even faster. You don't have to say anything, she whispered, her lips curving into a small knowing smile. Just stop pretending. I had tried to ignore it, to convince myself it wasn't real. But now that she was standing so close with her eyes locked on mine, there was no denying it anymore. Claire moved forward and gently brushed her lips across my cheek before I could reply. The gesture was straightforward, almost innocuous, but it set every nerve in my body on fire. I stood motionless, unable to move or think, until it finally dawned on me that this was not merely a mental image, that CLA was also experiencing this tension, and that there was no turning back now. As Claire's kisses touched my cheek, I stood still. My heart went into overdrive even though it was only a tease, a glimpse of something deeper, rather than a complete kiss. A part of me wanted to push her away to stop this before it got any worse. But another part of me, the one I had been trying to ignore, wanted her to stay close so I could see where this was going. Claire, I whispered, my voice barely audible, the warmth of her breath against my skin, the subtle pressure of her lips lingering in the air between us. Instead of moving, she continued to grin with the same kind, perceptive smile that made my pulse race. What? The words felt hollow and empty, as if I didn't believe them myself. My mind was racing trying to make sense of what was happening. She asked innocently, as if nothing unusual had happened. But the tension between us was undeniable, now crackling like static electricity in the air. I started. This was my stepsister Claire. This was incorrect, wasn't it? She then took another step closer, her body lightly touching mine, and I could feel the heat radiating from her skin. Her warm touch made my breath catch, and I experienced a rush of emotions that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Confusion, excitement, fear, and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. Who says we can't? She whispered, her eyes fixed on mine, a question hanging between us like a challenge in her stare. I forced myself to swallow, but with her so near and her touch sending shockwaves through my entire body, it was impossible to think clearly. But do you know why I said it? My voice was uncertain and unsteady as Claire's hand moved slowly and deliberately down my chest, making my heart race even more. It appears to me that you've been wanting this as much as I have. So she said quietly, her lips curling into a mischievous smile. Her words hit me like a blow to the belly, and I reeled, stiffening my thoughts. Was she correct? I had always desired this. However, there was also something more powerful. A part of me had been waiting for this moment, had been desiring it without even recognizing it. The notion sent a chill down my spine, and I felt a wave of shame rise inside me. I'm not sure why I began, but my voice faltered again, unable to complete the phrase. CLA moved closer, her body now completely against mine, and I could feel her heart beating quickly through her chest. Her eyes were intense, full of inquiry and want, and it was hard to take your eyes off of them. With her thumb softly grazing my jaw and her palm slipping up to rest on the side of my neck, she said, You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to be afraid. Everything about this felt wrong, but it also felt right, as if we had been moving toward this moment for a long time, even if neither of us had been willing to acknowledge it. Claire, I tried this again, but my voice faltered. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet, as if the world had swung off its axis, and I was spinning out of control. The faintest of touches, her fingertips grazing my lips, silenced me as she shook her head. "It's all right," she responded quietly and steadily. "You don't need to say anything. Anything." And then, before I could stop her, Claire moved in and planted a delicate yet powerful kiss on my lips. At first, it was tender, even tentative, as though she was giving me an opportunity to back out. But I didn't, did I? Instead, I found myself kissing her back with my hands moving instinctively to her waist, drawing her closer. The kiss deepened, slowly and deliberately, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me, spreading like wildfire. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, every inch of my skin buzzing with the intensity of the moment Claire's hands slid up to tangle in my hair, her body pressing against mine in a way that made it hard to breathe. And I didn't want it to stop when we finally pulled apart, both of us gasping for air, our foreheads resting against each other as we struggled to catch our breath. The world seemed to blur around us, and for a moment, it seemed as though time had stopped, as if nothing else mattered, and we were caught up in something neither of us had anticipated. I spoke in a tremulous but disbelieving whisper, and CLA glanced up at me with a kind, almost playful smile. "How does it feel?" I gulped hard since I wasn't sure how to respond to it, and my thoughts were still racing. There seemed to be no turning back now, no way to reverse what had just transpired. But it also seemed as though everything had suddenly changed, as if the tension that had been building between us for weeks had finally boiled over. Claire's grin wavered a little, but she didn't move away. Instead, she stared at me with an intensity that made my heart race again. "I don't know," I said gently, my hands still on her waist. "But we can't do this." "Why doesn't she?" whispered quietly. "Why couldn't we?" Her comments made me feel both excited and confused, and my stomach turned. Even though this was wrong, it had to be. The way she was staring at me and kissing me made it seem so genuine and certain. "You're my stepsister," I murmured weakly, but even as I said it, Claire arched an eyebrow and smiled back. "So what?" Felt more like an excuse than a justification. Her tone was kind yet firm as she requested. "We are only two individuals and are not biological relatives." Her reasoning made my head spin. "But you don't have to let that stop you." Although she was correct in theory, we were only related by our parents' marriage and not by blood. The fact that we were not related nevertheless weighed heavily on me. "But what about them? How about Dad? And Linda?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Claudia's smile faded, and she sighed softly, stepping back just enough to create a little space between us. I know she admitted her voice was quiet, but I know that I don't want to pretend like nothing's happening between us anymore. Her words hit me hard, and I felt a surge of emotions rise up inside me. Guilt, confusion, and something deeper. Something I wasn't ready to name. She was right. We couldn't keep pretending. The tension between us had been growing for too long, and now that it had finally come to a head, there was no going back. But what were we supposed to do now? "I don't know if we can just ignore this," I said quietly, my mind still spinning. Claire nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at me. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," she said gently. "We can take it one step at a time." Her words brought a strange sense of calm to the storm that had been raging inside me. She was right. We didn't have to have all the answers right away. We just had to be honest with ourselves and with each other about what was happening. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my chest start to ease. "Okay," I said softly. "One step at a time." Claire smiled, a real, genuine smile this time, and the sight of it made my heart swell. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly. Together. And in that moment I believed her. But the story definitely wasn't over yet. The days after that moment in the kitchen passed in a haze, and the tension between Claire and me only seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't just the memory of the kiss or the way her touch had set my nerves on fire. It was the fact that we both knew we had crossed a line we could never uncross. And now everything had changed. We tried to go about our days like normal, like nothing had happened. But it was impossible every time we were in the same room. The air felt charged with something unspoken, something electric. Every glance, every accidental touch, sent my heart racing, and I could see the same intensity in Claire's eyes. It was like a magnet pulling us toward each other, even though we both knew it was dangerous. One evening about a week after that moment in the kitchen, I found myself sitting on the couch in the living room trying to focus on the TV. But my mind kept wandering. I could hear Claire moving around in the kitchen, the sound of plates clinking and cabinets closing as she cleaned up after dinner. My dad and Linda were out again, probably at some dinner party, leaving the house empty except for the two of us. The house felt too quiet, too empty, and my thoughts were louder than ever. I couldn't stop thinking about CLA, about the way she had looked at me, the way her lips had felt against mine, and the way her touch had lingered long after she'd pulled away. Every moment alone with her was filled with an undercurrent of tension. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Just as I was about to get up and head to my room, Claire appeared in the doorway of the living room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, her eyes locking onto mine. The look on her face sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my pulse quicken. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. "Yeah, just thinking." Claire walked into the room, tossing the dish towel onto a nearby chair before sitting down on the edge of the couch just a few feet away from me. The air between us crackled with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "What about?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. The truth was I had been thinking about her, about us, ever since that night in the kitchen. But I didn't know how to say that out loud. I didn't know if I was ready to confront the reality of what was happening between us. Just everything I said, finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Claire nodded, her gaze still fixed on me. "Yeah, me too." For a moment we just sat there in silence, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, hanging heavily in the air. I could feel the pull between us, the magnetic force that seemed to draw us closer with every passing second. And I knew that if I didn't get up and walk away now, things were about to escalate in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. But I didn't move. Instead, I found myself leaning toward her, drawn by an invisible force that I couldn't fight anymore. CLA didn't pull away. She held my gaze, her eyes softening, and I could see the same desire mirrored in her expression. She wanted this as much as I. "Did we say we'd take it slow?" I murmured, my voice shaky. Claire smiled, a small knowing smile that made my heart race. "We are taking it slow," she said softly, "but it doesn't mean we have to ignore what's happening." Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Claire met me halfway, her lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative, just like the first time. But this time there was no hesitation, no guilt, just the two of us finally giving in to the tension that had been building for weeks. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I felt CLA's hand slide up to rest on the back of my neck, pulling me closer. My heart pounded in my chest, my skin buzzing with the intensity of the moment. It was like everything else faded away and all that mattered was her. Her touch, her warmth, her presence when we finally pulled apart. Both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. The world seemed to blur around us, and for a moment it felt like we were the only two people in the universe. "We should probably stop," I said quietly, though I didn't really mean it. My hands were still on her waist, and I didn't want to let go. Claire smiled, her fingers gently brushing the side of my face. "Do you really want to stop?" I hesitated, my heart racing. "I don't know. I just don't want to mess things up." She sighed softly, her forehead still resting against mine. "I get it, but maybe we're not messing anything up. Maybe we're just figuring things out." Her words hung in the air between us, and I couldn't help but think she was right. This didn't feel like a mistake. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like something that had been building for a long time. something that was Finn finding its way to the surface. I don't know what we're supposed to do. I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. Claire leaned into. But I know, she said. And then, at that moment, I couldn't hold it anymore. And she noticed. And so she kissed me. It was with passion. And we both let ourselves go. Felt amazing. I didn't realize what was happening. That's how much I was enjoying the moment and the intimacy of what the kiss led to. I guess because of how excited I was. It was over pretty quick. But she didn't seem to care. It felt like a relief. After a minute she moved, and as she stood up, she said, "We'll figure it out," and then disappeared upstairs on her way to the stairs. I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The days that followed felt like we were living in some sort of suspended reality. Claire and I had crossed a line. And there was no going back. Every glance, every touch, every moment alone carried a weight that we both felt but didn't fully acknowledge. We didn't talk about what had happened between us. But the connection was always there. Undeniable and impossible to ignore. I tried to go about my routine as normally as possible, but it felt like everything had changed. I was hyper-aware of Claire's presence in the house. The way her footsteps sounded as she moved around, the way her eyes seemed to follow me whenever we were in the same room. It was as if the air itself had thickened, making every interaction between us feel charged with something unspoken. One evening, about a week after that second kiss, we found ourselves alone in the house again. My dad and Linda had gone out for dinner, leaving us with the kind of silence that seemed to amplify every thought, every feeling. I was sitting at the kitchen table flipping through a magazine. I wasn't really reading, trying to distract myself from the tension that seemed to be building with every passing second. Cla walked into the kitchen, her movements slow and deliberate, and I felt my pulse quickened as she sat down across from me. The room was dimly lit. The only light coming from the overhead lamp above the table cast soft shadows across her face. She didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on me, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. I set the magazine down, my heart racing. I had been dreading this conversation even though I knew it was inevitable. We couldn't keep pretending like nothing had happened. We couldn't keep ignoring the elephant in the room. "Yeah," I replied, my voice shaky. "I guess we do." Claire leaned forward, her hands clasped together on the table in front of her for a moment. She didn't say anything. She just stared at me as if trying to figure out how to begin. The silence between us was heavy, almost suffocating, and I could feel the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on me. "I don't know what to do," she said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and vulnerability. "I don't know how we're supposed to act now." I nodded, swallowing hard as I tried to find the right words. "Me neither." The truth was, I didn't have any answers. I didn't know what we were supposed to do, how we were supposed to move forward. All I knew was that things between us had changed and there was no going back to the way things had been before. "Do you regret it?" Claire asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her question caught me off guard, and I felt a surge of panic rise up inside me. Did I regret it? The kisses, the moments we had shared, the connection that had been building between us for weeks. My mind raced as I tried to process her question. But the answer was clear, even if I didn't want to admit it. "No," I said quietly, shaking my head. "I don't regret it." Claire's shoulders relaxed slightly, and I could see a flicker of relief in her eyes. "Me neither," she admitted, her voice soft. "But I'm scared." I frowned, leaning forward, scared of what she sighed, running a hand through her hair as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I'm scared of what this means," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared of what happens if we keep going. I'm scared of what happens if we don't." Her words hit me hard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I knew exactly what she meant because I felt it too. There was a part of me that wanted to keep going to see where this connection between us would lead. But there was also a part of me that was terrified of the consequences. Terrified of what it would mean for our family, for my dad, for Linda. "I don't know what the right thing," I admitted, my voice was barely more than a whisper. "But I don't want to lose you." Claire looked up at me, her eyes filled with emotion. "You won't," she said softly, "but we have to figure this out." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, we did. For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging heavily in the air. The tension between us was still there, undeniable and electric. But there was also something else now, a sense of understanding, a realization that we couldn't keep going the way we had been. We had to make a decision. Claire stood up. Suddenly, pushing her chair back and walking over to the window. She stood there for a moment, staring out at the darkening sky, her arms crossed over her chest. I watched her, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to say, what to do. What if we took a break? She suggested finally, her back still turned to me. A break, I echoed, frowning. Claire turned to face me, her expression serious. Yeah. A break from whatever this is, give ourselves some time to think, to figure out what we really want. Her words made sense, but they also filled me with a sense of dread. The thought of stepping back, of putting distance between us, made my chest tighten. But at the same time I knew she was right. We couldn't keep going like this, caught in the middle of something we didn't fully understand. Maybe that's a good idea, I said quietly, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. Claire nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at me. We don't have to make any decisions right now, she said gently, but we need some space to figure things out. I swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. Yeah. You're right. The room fell into silence again. But this time it felt different. The tension between us had eased slightly, replaced by a sense of clarity, of understanding. We didn't have all the answers, but we had taken the first step toward figuring things out. And that was enough for now. Claire walked back over to the table, sitting down across from me again. She reached out, taking my hand in hers, and the simple gesture sent a wave of warmth through me. Her touch was familiar, comforting, and in that moment I realized that no matter what happened between us, I didn't want to lose her. She was too important to me. We'll figure it out, she said softly, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of my hand. One day at a time, I nodded, squeezing her hand gently. One day at a time. And in that moment I knew she was right. We didn't have to rush into anything. We didn't have to know all the answers right now. We just had to take it one day at a time and let things unfold naturally. As the evening wore on, the tension between us slowly faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. We didn't need to talk about what had happened or what would come next. We just needed to be there for each other, to take things slowly, to figure out how we felt. We didn't kiss again that night. We didn't push things further. Instead, we sat together in the quiet of the kitchen, holding hands and talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying each other's company. The weight of our situation was still there, but it didn't feel as overwhelming as it had before. We had taken the first step toward figuring things out. And that was enough. As the minutes turned into hours and the house remained quiet around us, I realized something. No matter what happened between CLA and me, no matter what we decided in the days to come, I knew one thing for certain. I had crossed a line that never could be uncrossed. But deep down it didn't even bother me.